Hello. There's a lot to talk about over this weekend, which has reportedly been quiet in terms of battle activity. There's actually quite a bit I'd like to discuss. I'd like to just start a little bit with the Zaporozhye power plant and the draining of the Kakhovka reservoir, which happened a week or so ago. As we know, the dam wall was destroyed. And this has caused flooding downstream, but also has caused the main reservoir to drain. So in draining the reservoir, what this means is that the Ukrainians now, while they did have a 5 kilometre stretch of water between them and the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, they now have 5 kilometres of mudflats between them. So there has been a lot of discussion as to whether there was a planned attack on the nuclear power plant, or if that may happen, and what impact the draining of the reservoir may have had. Now, I'm just going to jump into speculation mode here because it's fun to do sometimes. So clearly the mud is a problem. This will be deep mud at the bottom of a reservoir in what Andrew Makuris on the Duran reported earlier today. He believed had prior to the reservoir being dammed and being flooded was actually marshland anyhow. So this area won't dry out quickly. So the ability to move troops across that, tanks and that sort of heavy equipment is not going to be a viable option unless you were to consider something like a hovercraft. Now, hovercraft can travel quite easily across mudflats, across land, across water. I did a little bit of looking around and research on this, and while it was by no means in-depth or exhaustive, there is a Zubr-class landing craft air cushion, LCAC. This is a monstrous hovercraft. Now, in the information I could find, these used to be developed in Ukraine, in the Crimea, prior to 2014. And I found some reports indicating that in the early 2000s that the Ukraine had at least 2 of these. Now, these are big enough that they displace 560 tons. They can carry 3 main battle tanks in them, or 10 armoured personnel carriers, and up to 230 troops. Now, I'm not suggesting that Ukraine have a couple of these stuck away somewhere, which they'll just pop out and suddenly carry 6 tanks and 500 troops across to the plant. But interestingly, the FC Dynamo Kyiv Ukrainian football team bought a small hovercraft for some border guards. And so again, while I have no idea or no ability to determine how many hovercrafts there may be in Ukraine, I would imagine there may be some. And I would imagine if you had been planning something like this for some time, you may well have been manufacturing them. So it's feasible that an attack could be made using hovercrafts. Now, the large Zubr-class LCACs, they travel at up to 63 knots, or about 115 kilometres an hour. Now, that's pretty quick across mudflats, across a 5 kilometre distance. Again, I'm not suggesting that smaller ones could travel that fast, but you could see how you could arrange a surprise attack here, where people would think, okay, nothing's coming across here. Even guys walking across here, going through the mud, trying to do it on dirt bikes is going to bog down. There's no way they can do it without taking ages and ages, unless you would use hovercraft. Anyhow, it's an idea. I think something interesting. Right, what else have we got here? So, yeah, a little bit of thought just around the whole idea of an attack on the ZPP. Simplicius The Thinker has provided some thoughts on this, again, as he always does, he or she always does. They're actually wondering or questioning whether there might actually really be a planned attack there, or if it may just be a psyop and an attempt to try to draw Russian resources to add additional resources to protect the nuclear power plant. The reasons that he's given for it being possibly a psyop operation is that there's complexity in making any attack on the power plant a positive for the Ukraine. If the Ukrainians shell the power plant and that becomes known, then clearly that's a bad look. If, however, they were to get some troops in there and assume control and take control of the plant, they could then feasibly cause damage to the plant and claim it was the Russians doing so, trying to oust them. So, interesting just to see what will happen with this. Certainly the situation has changed, because what could have been an amphibious assault across water now, for some period of time, will not be the case, unless, again, given that there are other dams higher upstream, if they were to be opened or blown such as they sent down a flood of water, then you might get another period of time where you've suddenly got water across the reservoir again, and that 5 kilometre stretch becomes a stretch of water rather than mud. Interesting. Look, in terms of the battle, yes, there's still lots of battle going on. Avdiivka, Marinka, around there, that area, and even Bakhmut. Again, some of the reports coming out from the Russian Ministry of Defense over the last couple of days are indicating large numbers of Ukrainian soldiers being killed in battles in these regions and other regions. However, the actual amount of reporting coming out has been a little quieter. Certainly since Yevgeny Prigozhin and the Wagner PMC have been pulled out of active operation, there's been a decline in news reports. You may recall or notice that the Bakhmut fight, Artyomsk as it's now known, the fighting there was well publicised, and Prigozhin seemed to be quite happy for his troops to post to social media about what was going on, the battles they were undertaking. Doesn't seem to be the case in many other areas of the battlefront. Prigozhin and the Wagner are supposed to be back on duty on the 6th of August. So if that does happen, we might see a big uptick at that stage in terms of news coming out. So yeah, just moving away from what's happening in the battlefront, but talking about some of the wider Ukrainian war news items. Mikhail Podolyak, who's advisor to the President of Ukraine, has suggested that there is no offensive, and that what's happening is just testing and allows the Ukrainians to move some of their forces forward, locate where Russian defences are, and get a feel for what's there, what sort of air defence there is. And now all of this makes sense. Certainly, it is something that the Ukrainians would be doing, but this will be things that you would expect the Ukrainians would be doing with smaller forces, smaller reconnaissance groups, not the large columns of Leopards and Bradleys that we have seen in the early days of this offensive or non-offensive being destroyed, with a lot of video evidence of that. Also, what Podolyak is saying is conflicting with something which General Petraeus spoke of just prior to the offensive. So, interesting, in a Guardian interview, in just days before the offensive, I'll just read some of what General Petraeus had said. On the counter-offensive, he said, "I think this counter-offensive is going to be very impressive. My sense is that they will achieve combined arms effect. In other words, they will successfully carry out combined arms operations where you have engineers that are breaching the obstacles and defusing the minefields and so forth. Armour following right on through, protected by infantry against anti-tank missiles, air defence keeping the Russians' aircraft off them, electronic warfare jamming the radio networks, logistics right up behind them, artillery and mortars right out in front of them. And most important of all is that as the lead elements inevitably culminate after 72 to 96 hours, physically that's about as far as you can go, and they will have taken losses. You'll then have follow-on units that will push right on through and capitalise on the progress." So this seems to indicate that the West and the Ukrainians were expecting there to be some big progress in that first 72 to 96 hours. And that just doesn't seem to have eventuated. So reading this one gets the impression that the offensive is happening and has been happening, but perhaps has not gone to plan, with some underestimation of the Russian forces and capabilities. We're still yet to see a big push. As I've talked about before, who knows when that will come, whether the Ukrainians will just throw some smaller forces at the line for the next few weeks and wait until they receive some additional equipment. This week, Biden has announced an aid package of $325 million, which includes a number of Strikers and Bradleys to replace the ones that have been destroyed. The Germans are reporting that they will be providing 100 Leopard 1s sometime this year. So we've already seen a change in tactics from the Ukrainians, where they're not sending these big columns out through the minefields and instead are sending smaller forces, using a tactic where they're using their APCs, armoured personnel carriers, to race up towards Russian positions, to drop the troops off, and then to get out of the area, keep mobile, provide support from a distance, but not leading these excursions with tanks. So different tactics being employed. Perhaps the Ukrainians starting to husband some of their resources and take care of them and try to prolong the amount of time that they've got. Perhaps the start of a stalling tactic to keep those resources available until they can receive more from the West. So we will see. There are talks, of course, of there being 400 to 600 tanks in the Ukrainian stocks at the moment, and that a large wedge of these could be seen driven towards Mariupol, perhaps down through the Tokmak area, somewhere like that. That may happen. Yet to see that at this stage. The Western media, however, is starting to admit that there are problems with the offensive. There's a new Washington Post article out, and it talks about some of the challenges that are being seen. It talks about that the NATO trained and equipped brigades, things like the 37th and the 47th, they have undergone modern training to NATO standards and were armed with modern weapons supplied from the West. But within 20 minutes after their offensive, they suffered heavy losses. And so now this is in the Washington Post, being reported in the West. One of the points in the article states that there were about 50 people in a military unit with the call sign woodcutter, and that after their initial offensive, 30 did not return. So it's very high attrition rates. And as I say, this is now interesting that this is being reported not through Russian telegram channels or from the Russian Ministry of Defense, but in the Washington Post. Of those 30 who did not return, indications are that they were killed, wounded, or captured by the Russians. The article goes on to say that 5 units of armoured vehicles of the unit were destroyed in the first hour. And a comment from one of the guys fighting was that we stayed there in the field without tanks and heavy armoured vehicles. We were fired on from mortars from 3 sides. There was nothing we could do. It sounds like it really was quite a terrible place to be trying to advance. Also worrying for the US is the article reveals that some of the survivors of the 37th were American mercenaries. So for a number of reasons, this might be troubling to the US. One, the US doesn't generally really want to announce that there are Americans fighting in Ukraine, this being a proxy war between the US and Russia. They like to keep the illusion that it is Ukrainians fighting, although we know there have been many mercenaries from many different countries fighting there. Australia, New Zealand, America, many Polish reported fighting in areas, and sometimes the Russian reports have said that almost all they can hear when they've intercepted Ukrainian communications in some areas has been Polish language. But for another concerning feature is that in this 37th Brigade, if there are American mercenaries in there, and this is a NATO-trained brigade with Western American equipment, that it's quite possible that even though they've suffered these quite large failures, it may well have been American combatants driving some of these pieces of equipment and perhaps commanding some of these groups. So while there's been a lot of news reporting that the Ukrainians have failed in this offensive, what may be concerning is that perhaps some of these failures have been led by Americans. Now, I can't corroborate this other than this information coming from the Washington Post article that some of these survivors were from the 37th Brigade were Americans. But it does then begin to make you wonder how the West is feeling about that if they do have well-trained people suffering these sorts of losses, and if it makes them consider what may occur in larger offensives. I think you need to recognise that the US military hasn't fought in a situation like this where they lack air superiority, where they're outgunned by large numbers in terms of artillery. When they've gone into Iraq and in Afghanistan, they've gone straight in with air superiority, and really that's given them the ability to fight the way that they normally fight. Now, without that, they're perhaps having to learn new tactics. This also brings up another interesting point, which is that the US and the West, some reports are that there's some concerns in the military that while the Russians are getting the opportunity to effectively train against NATO tactics and methods and to train against Western and NATO equipment, the NATO forces aren't getting to do the same thing because the forces are primarily Ukrainian, and because those frontline forces have been suffering such heavy losses that a lot of the experience gained fighting the Russians is being lost or is just contained with relatively new Ukrainian fighters, and the West is missing that opportunity. So I think the plan had been that this would be over quickly if it started with Russia, that Putin would back down, the Russians would get scared, they wouldn't have enough resources, and they would give up. With that not happening, there are now these growing concerns in the West that they are perhaps giving too much away to the Russians by engaging them and not getting back that learning themselves. Related to that point is the reports coming out this weekend of the Russian military engineers investigating the leopards. So some leopards that have been captured and now being dismantled, pulled apart by the Russians, and they're releasing their comments are less than favourable in their opinions of the equipment, talking about it having brittle armour and not being thick enough and problems with it that they can foresee. Now, this you would expect, normal sort of propaganda. You've got rubbish equipment, Americans, we've caught them, we've had a look through it, we know all about it. Well, yes, on one hand, they do know all about it, which must be a concern. I mean, I'm sure there will be some procedures the Ukrainians would have taken when abandoning those, or if they were able to abandon them safely, to, I'm sure, destroy some of the critical components, or perhaps even take some of them with them. But who knows? There would still be quite a lot that the Russian tank engineers would now be learning from looking at these captured leopards. But perhaps even more worrying is the commercial impact that this may now have in terms of Germany being able to sell leopards around the world. If what was touted as another game changer in the war, and the amazing German leopards, to see them in their first battles, just 6 of them or more destroyed and smoking on the battlefield, can't be helping the sales team who are trying to promote them around the world. Particularly now, if they're also learning that, if you do buy leopards, yes, they may have some troubles with Russians, and the Russians have got a few of them and probably know how they work and where your weak spots are. This seems to also be kind of corroborated by reporting coming out that the UK has asked the Office for the President of Ukraine not to lead with Challenger tanks in the vanguard position. So if there's a column going out, please don't put the Challengers out front. Now, the Challengers are big, heavy battle tanks. But the British are worried that if they suffer the same fate as the Leopards, then suddenly they've got the same problem. Their much vaunted Challenger tanks are shown to not be effective against Russian fighting conditions, and where you don't have air superiority to protect your tanks. And again, the ability to sell those then decreases, and I'm sure that the Russian military military machine will be doing whatever it can to put out information, now detailed information, comparing Leopard 2s to their T90s, to be able to present a rosy picture about them and sell them around the world. All right, enough about tanks. Just some news, some interesting news. So this, the head of the GRU, or the Ukrainian Directorate for Military Intelligence, Kirill Budanov. Now, Budanov had been quite appearing quite frequently in social media, and then a couple of weeks ago there was a reported missile strike on the GRU headquarters in Kiev. And since that time, Budanov has not been seen or heard of. Reports have come out this weekend, coming out that he is in a German hospital now in a critical condition, perhaps in a coma, and that he did suffer critical injuries in that strike on the GRU headquarters. There has been a video, I've watched the video, which came out subsequent to that attack, which shows allegedly Budanov. I've got to say, if it was a video put out to try to suppress or counteract the rumours that he had been injured, it's the weirdest attempt to do that. The video goes for about 30 seconds, and it's Budanov sitting at a desk breathing. That's it. It just almost seems to be excessive breathing, and he blinks once during the film clip. That's it. There's no words. He says nothing. He doesn't move. I have heard people saying that it's clearly AI. Hey, AI is so good now. It's difficult. Well, I don't think I can any longer tell you that it was clearly AI or not, but it was clearly unusual. If you haven't seen it, it's on Twitter. It's a very unusual video to come out to claim that he's fine and was not injured. My personal opinion, from what I've seen and read, I'm starting to feel more and more likely that yes, he was injured. This is very similar to Valery Zaluzhny, the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces in Ukraine. A similar thing a couple of weeks ago, he claimed that he had been injured. He was taken to hospital, and not as badly injured as Budanov has been claimed to be. And then again, one very unusual video came out of him afterwards. Again, he said a few words. He didn't do much. He seemed to be in an unusual sort of mood. I don't know. While I can't corroborate this, either way, it's entirely possible that that video had been filmed prior to the attack, in which it was claimed that he was also injured, or perhaps it may well have been filmed after. I don't know. But interestingly, video has come out this weekend of a meeting with Zelensky with a group of what appear to be high-level Ukrainian military staff, and neither Zaluzhny nor Budanov are present. So the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces and the head of the military intelligence, neither of them present, and no explanation given for them not being there. It does seem unusual. So some other things, again, just circling a little wider around what's happening in Ukraine. So South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has been in Kiev via Poland, and has allegedly had some trouble while in Poland. His trip to the Ukraine and to Kiev and to Moscow is in an attempt to sort of negotiate some sort of peace deal. There's also there's been an economic meeting going on in Russia in St. Petersburg, in which he and his party will no doubt have been attending. But when in Poland, his security detail was allegedly stopped from travelling because they had weapons, which you would expect that the Polish would be aware that a president of a nation's security detail would have weapons with them. I have heard some reports that there were large numbers of weapons, maybe true. In either case, that caused a bit of a kerfuffle, and some of these South African counterparts travelling with him have indicated that they felt that it was an attempt to disrupt the peace negotiation process that he was undertaking, and Ramaphosa was actually required to travel onto Kiev on his own without his security detail. Also, interestingly, just in the last day, there's been reports from some of the South African party who are in Kiev that while Ukraine has reported there was another missile strike on Kiev, there's been nothing from the Russian Ministry of Defense. Now, the Russian Ministry of Defense is usually quite open about talking about when they have missile strikes and what missiles they fired. There was nothing from them about this. And when questioned about it, some of these South Africans stated that while they were in Kiev, when the missile strike was allegedly happening, they heard no air raid sirens, they heard no explosions, they weren't made aware of any missile strikes occurring on Kiev at that time. So, interesting. Interesting that the Ukrainian story about the missile strike is that 6 Kinjals were fired and were shot down. Now, I think we know fairly conclusively that a few weeks ago the Russians lost a Patriot missile system. I'll get to this in a moment, but Putin in a speech on the weekend indicates that 5 Patriot systems have been destroyed in Kiev. So now there were talks originally of 3 having been supplied. Perhaps there were others. But in the video that we saw of one of them being destroyed, it does appear that that was a Kinjal that got through. So this seems like this is some Ukrainian propaganda indicating they've shot down these Kinjals. The Kinjals allegedly are very difficult to shoot down. But the South Africans are not playing along with it, apparently. So anyhow, difficult to tell for sure, but an interesting story. One would have thought that if Kiev was under missile attack by Kinjals, there would have been air raid sirens reported by the South Africans when they were there, or at least they would have been made aware that this was happening. There were airstrikes in the areas around Kiev. Now, another interesting one. So, on the recommendation of the US, India was asked to join NATO, or NATO Plus. Now, S. Jaishankar, who is Foreign Minister for India, has ruled out India joining NATO. And after the American recommendation, he has stated, where the Americans stated that winning the strategic competition with the Chinese Communist Party and ensuring the security of Taiwan demands the United States strengthens ties with our allies and security partners, including India. By including India in NATO Plus, security arrangements would build upon the US and India's close partnership to strengthen global security and deter the aggression of the CCP across the Indo-Pacific region. So this the response from Jaishankar to this was that the NATO template doesn't apply to India. So this is another example of the divergence of countries like Brazil, India, Saudi Arabia from the West, where we're seeing stronger ties with nations like Saudi Arabia discussing possibly involvement with BRICS, with the Russian foreign minister indicating that they have 20 countries indicating an interest in joining BRICS. Yeah, a lot of sort of escalation going on. The same, which is the lower house of the bicameral parliament in Poland, has stated that the procedure of inviting Finland and Sweden to join the NATO alliance can also be applied to Ukraine, and that the same of the Republic of Poland will support endeavours to strengthen the alliance's political and practical cooperation with Ukraine and to build consensus for Ukraine's accession to NATO. So while on one hand we've got India saying we're not interested in joining NATO, we've got Poland now very actively indicating that they believe that Ukraine should be admitted to NATO under the same method that Finland and Sweden were. This counteracted then by comments from Sergei Lavrov, where he was discussing some remarks made by Putin in his speech, which is yesterday, where Putin had said that Russia had tried to build a partnership with the West, but everything went down the drain because the Western countries were not ready for equal interaction. And then Lavrov went on to say that the West sees Russia solely as a territory to be developed and used in the colonial sense, to live at the expense of others. We have resources. The West gave us technology, and we were to provide them with cheap oil, gas, and other mineral resources that we are rich in, while they were supposed to supply us with everything we needed for cultural life and the development of the automobile industry. It's all over, said Lavrov. So there's tensions with between Russia and the US. There's nothing improving there. Things are escalating. All around there are indications of this separation and this breakdown in relationships. The Black Sea grain deal. So the president of the Russian Federation, Dmitry Peskov, has given stronger indications just today that the Russians will not renew that grain deal, and they feel that they've, while they have honoured their side of the bargain, they believe that that has not been returned to them. They're facing issues with logistics and sanctions over their goods, and problems getting insurance for the shipping of their grain and products, the destruction of the nitrogen, the ammonia pipeline coming down to Odessa. So again, if this doesn't go ahead and the Russians don't extend this agreement, then what that means in practice is that the Russian fleet will block the three Odessa ports and will cease the allowing the export of Ukrainian grain and products from those ports. Now, again, just another item which indicates this further change in global power, and this relates to the de-dollarization of the US dollar as the global reserve currency, is that Rosneft, Russia's largest oil producer, and China National Petroleum Corporation have agreed and decided that they will now buy and sell oil in rubles and yuan. So instead of using dollars, which has been done in the past, they will now trade in their own currencies. So this, if this continues, and it looks like this may, with things like Saudi Arabia showing interest in perhaps joining BRICS or trading in the BRICS groups, which would then see them trading in yuan and rubles rather than US dollars. So this would lead to a weakening of the US dollar, a weakening of demand for US stocks and shares, and the impact that would have upon the economy. A loss of the ability for the US to run the large budget deficits that they do, and the loss of using the US dollar as a tool or a weapon. For example, against a country like Iran, where America will put a sanction in place and say no trading in US dollars for you, no purchasing of US dollars for you allowed, which, if you're working in a global economy where everything is purchased in US dollars, well, suddenly you can't purchase things. Now, if oil can be purchased in rubles or yuan, then you can now just ignore that US sanction and go and trade in other currencies. So just following on the economic area, so Economic Forum just held in St. Petersburg this weekend. So a couple of the points that Putin mentioned. Russian GDP, this is up until April, had grown by 3.3% in annual terms, and that they are expecting by the end of this year an additional percentage point of growth, and that unemployment is at historic lows at also down at 3.3%. So the war effort in Russia seems to not only have been reducing unemployment, we've heard about the massive uptick in the last year in munitions and weapons production, tanks production, and all of the subsidiary industries that go along with providing components into those things like tanks and aircraft, plus the move away from the reliance on any Western componentry. So there would no doubt be work in the electronics sector and software sectors and things like this all throughout Russia, which would be leading, applying downward pressure on unemployment, and similarly the GDP rising with this massive effort, a decrease in unemployment, more people in the workforce and producing more. Then the Russian economy seems to be doing well, and it does look as though the sanctions, which were intended to cripple the Russian economy, have in effect not had that effect and may even be backfiring against the West. So an example also being the oil price cap, which has been enforced by the UN and the US against Russian oil. Now, many countries like India and China have just simply been ignoring this and have been buying at discounts from the Russians, and then on selling that oil to the West. So while the sanctions say you can't buy Russian oil, as soon as that oil is in any way processed by an intermediary, it's no longer considered to be Russian oil and can be purchased. But the Indians are then selling that to Western European countries at an increase, at a markup, so that the Western countries, Germany and the likes of that, which are very energy hungry, require a lot of oil, are now paying higher prices because of the price cap that they've implemented. Putin also talked about F-16s because there's obviously been approval from the US for countries like the Netherlands to supply F-16s. Putin has stated that the F-16s, if they are provided to Ukraine, that the Russians will attack them, and they will attack them even if they are not in the Ukraine. So I guess my understanding of this is that if they're being launched from other countries, then Russia would strike them before they reached Ukraine, if they could. There has been a lot of talk of the F-16s needing to be launched from other countries, possibly from Poland, given that Poland has capabilities to maintain them. They've got a very high maintenance requirement. They require very nice runways. Damaged runways, poor quality runways just aren't good for F-16s, and Poland would have these. So the Russians may even take it a step further and say, well, if you're using F-16s against us and we can see them on Polish runways, we'll strike them there. This, of course, then leads to NATO joining the war in its entirety. Putin also spoke about the Ukrainian activities in the area of Belgorod being an area within the Russian border, and the drone attacks on the Kremlin and Moscow, that Russia sees these purely as provocations from Ukraine to entice Russia to overreact, to then allow NATO to join in. He said they're very aware of that and they're not going to play that game. On the Belgorod front, so this is up on an area of Russia and Ukraine where there hasn't been an active battlefront across all of that area, and so this is where Putin has mentioned that soon operations will start to enforce a sanitary corridor where they will move along into Ukraine to an area of 15 to 20 kilometers and push any Ukrainian military forces out of there, so as to stop them shelling into Russia, and which would then take the political pressure off Putin, which he must be suffering now, as he's got Russian civilians in Russia being shelled by the Ukrainians. Yes, he did mention that over 600 tanks and armoured vehicles have been destroyed in the 2 weeks of the counteroffensive from the Ukrainians. It's a large number, if it's true, if you believe it. It's a very large number of equipment to have been lost in such a short period of time. That 5 Patriot complexes have been destroyed near Kiev. And then finally he confirmed that, yes, Russia is placing tactical nuclear warheads into Belarus. Now, I've seen a lot of people get very, very concerned about this. You have to balance this with the fact that So the Russians moving some from Russia to Belarus. Yes, it's saber rattling, and it's just making giving the Belarusians something to show, to wave around as a stick, and perhaps to try to make the Ukrainians think twice, perhaps, about making any attacks on the Belarusian soil. But again, perhaps not as inflammatory as it sounds, given that these are counteracting already a number of American tactical nukes in the Western European countries. Just say an interesting story I saw, which is, well, I was looking around because Air Defender 2023 is going on at the moment. It winds up next week on the 23rd of June, where there's 200 or so jets doing exercises to simulate a NATO Article 5 operation, which is simulating where a NATO country has been attacked and then all NATO nations join together to respond. I think there's about 28 nations involved. There's 10,000 support personnel. This has been carried out in Germany, Czech Republic, and Poland, Romania. I think they're flying through those airspaces. But just looking through that, I came across a story where a Bulgarian site is now reporting that back in early 2022, when the Americans sent some F-35s over to do some reconnaissance and electronic sweeping of information, as the special military operation of the Ukraine war was kicking off, that an F-35 pilot got the bejesus scared out of him when an Su-30 just appeared on his shoulder from out of nowhere. Apparently, during the short period of time the Su-30 popped up, like at close range, the F-35 suffered a number of failures of its tracking and detection systems, which required a number of reboots while in flight. The Su-30 was able to appear and then drop out, and then it reappear again unexpectedly and undetected. Again, if this story is true, it again will be of concern for the US, because the F-35s are touted as the fifth generation, the best fighters ever built. Now, if Russian electronic warfare and jamming technology is such that they're not able to detect an Su-30 popping up on their six whenever they want, then they've got real problems with that. Again, maybe a completely made up story. I have no way of corroborating it. But the story itself sounded quite plausible. Who knows? I guess we'll find out more about that if things do progress, and if NATO do end up involving at some stage F-35s in the future in this conflict. Anyhow, that's enough for tonight. Thank you very much for listening. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to the channel. Talk soon.